Click through the scene, a gray dawn on the Roman frontier. The air is cold, and the only sounds are the distant call of a lone bird and the rhythmic, crunching footsteps of a sentry on the wooden rampart walkway. Then a horn cuts through the silence, sharp and clear. Suddenly, the quiet camp erupts into life. You can hear the muffled sounds of men stirring, the clatter of armor, and the low murmur of voices in a dozen different languages. This was the daily reality for tens of thousands of men stationed at the edges of the empire. But the true heart of their world wasn't the battlefield or the marching camp. It was the place they returned to every single day. It was the barracks. We often imagine Roman soldiers only in the heat of combat, a faceless wall of shields and swords. But have you ever stopped to wonder about the other 22 hours of their day? Who were these men when the fighting was done? Where did they sleep, eat, laugh, and grieve? What kind of community existed behind those fortified walls? A world almost entirely hidden from history. The story of the Roman barracks is the story of the soldier himself, a surprising and complex micro-society that was part military garrison, part industrial workshop, and part bustling home. It was a place of strict discipline and surprising comfort, of profound loneliness and deep camaraderie. Within those long, narrow buildings was contained an entire way of life, one that sustained the most powerful military machine the ancient world had ever known. In this journey, we're going to walk through those gates and pull back the curtain. We will explore the archaeology and the human stories to uncover what life was truly like within a Roman barracks. We'll discover not just where they slept, but what they owned, what they believed, and how they forged an identity far from home. This is a deep dive into the intimate, everyday world of the Roman legionary, a glimpse into the wooden and stone structures that housed the men who built an empire. Get ready to see the Roman army in a completely new light. But before we step into the crowded barracks block itself, we must first understand the absolute center of power and identity for the entire fort, the Principia. If the barracks were the beating heart of the legionaries' daily life, then the Principia was the brain and the soul of the entire operation. This wasn't just another building. It was the command center, the bank, the archives, and the most sacred temple, all rolled into one imposing structure. Located at the intersection of the fort's two main streets, its grand, columned entrance immediately signaled its importance, a place of order and authority in a world often defined by chaos. You would pass through a monumental gate into a spacious central courtyard, surrounded by a covered colonnade. This open area was a hive of constant activity. Here, you might see clerks hurrying with wax tablets, centurions receiving their orders, or soldiers gathering for formal announcements. But the true purpose of this courtyard, its most dramatic function, was revealed on payday. 3 times a year, the entire unit would assemble here, and each soldier would step forward to receive his hard-earned salary, a substantial sum of money after deductions for food, equipment, and burial club dues. This was the moment that made the long months of training and patrols tangible. Beyond the courtyard lay the heart of the heart, the cross hall, a vast, basilica-like room that served as the commander's office and tribunal. This was where military justice was administered, where strategies were planned, and where the commander held court. From this hall, doors led to a series of smaller offices and strong rooms, the administrative engine of the fort. Scribes worked here, maintaining the meticulous records for which the Roman army was famous: personnel files, supply inventories, duty rosters. In a heavily guarded chamber, the unit's pay chest was stored, the collective fortune of hundreds of men, a powerful symbol of the army's logistical might. And then, at the very rear of the complex, was the most secure and spiritually charged room of all, the Eads, or the shrine. This was the sacred home of the legion's soul. In this dimly lit, incense-filled chamber, housed in a special niche, stood the Aquila, the golden eagle standard. Losing this eagle in battle was the ultimate disgrace, a stain on the legion's honor that could only be wiped away by its recovery. The eagle was more than a flag. It was the physical embodiment of the legion's divine spirit, its luck, and its very identity. Flanking it were the signa, the smaller standards of each individual century, often adorned with discs and medallions. Soldiers would swear oaths on these standards, and they were the focal point of unit loyalty and pride. So, when a soldier looked toward the Principia, he didn't just see his commander's office. He saw the source of his orders, the guarantee of his pay, and the sacred symbol he was pledged to defend with his life. It was a constant, powerful reminder that he was part of something far greater than himself. Leaving the echoing, formal space of the Principia, our path now leads us to a very different kind of residence, one that embodied the sharp social hierarchy of the Roman army. Walk with me down the main street, and you would notice a distinct difference in the buildings. While the common soldiers lived in long, repetitive barrack blocks, the centurions, the backbone of the legion, resided in something far grander. Tucked at the end of each barrack block, or sometimes in a separate, prime location near the headquarters, stood the centurion's house. This wasn't just a room, it was a private, multi-roomed home, a world apart from the cramped contubernium his men called home. It was a physical declaration of status, a reward for the immense responsibility he carried. As the commander of a century, a unit of around 80 men, the centurion was responsible for everything from their combat training and discipline to their morale and administrative paperwork. He was expected to be the toughest, most experienced man in the unit, and his living quarters reflected this elevated position. Stepping inside one of these houses is like entering a small, well-appointed Roman villa. Instead of a single room shared with 7 others, the centurion enjoyed a suite of spaces. You would typically find a central reception room, a private bedroom, a small office or study for administrative work, and sometimes even a private kitchen and a small bath suite, a luxury almost unimaginable for the common soldier. The archaeology from sites like Vindolanda in northern Britain gives us a vivid picture. The floors might be made of sturdy wooden planks or even mortared stone, a step up from the packed earth floors of the soldiers' quarters. Fragments of window glass have been found, suggesting these homes could be sealed against the bitter frontier cold, another simple comfort denied to the rank and file. The centurion's house was also a place for personal expression and comfort. We have evidence of fine, imported Samian ware pottery, elegant glass vessels for serving wine, and even personal items like high-quality brooches and strigils, the curved metal tools used for cleaning oneself at the baths. These weren't just functional objects. They were statements of taste and wealth, connecting the centurion to the broader Roman culture of dining and leisure, even in the remotest outposts. This higher standard of living wasn't merely about privilege. It was intrinsically linked to the centurion's role. His house served as a command post, a meeting room, and a symbol of his authority. In his office, he would have kept his records, the duty rosters, training schedules, and reports that kept the century functioning. The central hall was where he might summon his junior officers, the optio and the tesserarius, to relay orders, or where he could host a formal meal to build camaraderie with his most trusted men. The contrast with his soldiers' lives was stark and deliberate. While his men lived a communal existence, sleeping, eating, and storing their gear in one cramped space, the centurion enjoyed privacy and space. This separation reinforced the chain of command. He was not their buddy, he was their commander, a figure of respect and sometimes fear, whose word was law. The distance between his comfortable home and their Spartan barracks was a constant physical reminder of the military hierarchy, a system built on discipline and clear lines of authority. The centurions' quarters were therefore much more than a nice place to live. They were a tool of command, a carefully designed environment that upheld the social structure that made the Roman legions so effective. Now, let us turn from the relative comfort and authority of the centurion's house and step into the true engine room of the legion, the cramped, noisy, and profoundly intimate space of the common barrack block. Imagine a long, low, rectangular building, built of timber or stone depending on the frontier and the era, stretching across the fort in a seemingly endless row. It's within these unassuming structures that the real life of the legionary unfolded. The entire building was divided into a series of identical, cell-like units, and each one was home to a group of 8 men known as a contubernium. This wasn't just a random assortment of soldiers. This was your military family, the people you lived with, fought alongside, and depended on for survival every single day. This small 8-man section was the absolute bedrock of Roman military organization, the fundamental building block upon which the entire legion was constructed. Crossing the threshold into one of these rooms is to step into a world of stark functionality. Archaeological reconstructions, like those at the Lunt Fort in England, show us a space that was astonishingly small, typically no more than 10 by 15 feet for all 8 men. There were no partitions, no private corners. This one room was their entire domestic world. It was their bedroom, their locker room, their kitchen, and their common area, all rolled into one. Against the rear wall, you'd find a raised stone or wooden platform. This was where they slept, side by side, likely on thin straw-filled mattresses laid directly on the hard surface. Personal space was a luxury that simply did not exist. You slept in your tunic, your kit stored meticulously beneath the platform, the sounds and smells of 7 other men a constant presence through the night. The rest of the floor space was a carefully managed chaos of personal and shared equipment. Each man had a designated area for his heavy marching pack, his sarsana, which held his spare clothes, a cloak, a cooking pot, rations, and entrenching tools. Their iconic segmented armor, the lorica segmentata, would be hung on pegs or stored in wooden chests when not in use, the heavy metal plates gleaming faintly in the dim light filtering through a single small window. This forced intimacy, however, was the crucible in which an unbreakable unit cohesion was forged. These 8 men did everything together. They were more than just roommates. They were a single tactical unit on the battlefield and a self-sufficient economic unit in the barracks. A crucial part of their dynamic revolved around food. While the army provided basic grain rations, it was up to the contubernium to prepare their own meals. In one corner of the room, or just outside the doorway, you would often find a simple, portable clay oven or a hearth. Here, the men would take turns grinding their wheat into flour to bake a simple, hearty bread, or they would combine their rations into a communal stew, a pulmentum, bubbling away in a bronze pot over the fire. They didn't eat in a massive mess hall. They ate right there in their cramped room, passing around a shared loaf and a cup of wine. This daily ritual of preparing and sharing food created powerful social bonds. It fostered a sense of collective responsibility and mutual dependence. You weren't just cooking for yourself, you were cooking for your 7 brothers. The success of your meal, and by extension your well-being, depended on the cooperation and contribution of every man in the group. The psychological impact of this living arrangement cannot be overstated. For a young recruit, often conscripted from a distant province like Hispania or Syria, the contubernium became his new world. He was separated from his biological family by hundreds of miles and years of service. In their place, he found a new family in these 7 other men. They witnessed each other's moments of weakness and strength. They celebrated a birthday or a promotion together in that cramped space, and they undoubtedly grieved together when one of their number fell in a skirmish or succumbed to illness. The room itself, for all its austerity, would have been personalized with small, poignant tokens of home. A carved figurine of a local god, a distinctive piece of jewelry, or a carefully repaired piece of pottery from their native region. The contubernium was therefore far more than a military designation or a sleeping arrangement. It was a survival mechanism, a support network, and the primary source of a soldier's identity and morale. The legendary discipline of the Roman legions was not born on the parade ground alone. It was cemented in these small, smoky, crowded rooms, where 8 men learned to live as one. While the stone and timber barracks provided a permanent anchor for the legionary's life, the Roman army's true power lay in its ability to project that same organized, disciplined existence deep into hostile territory. This brings us to one of the most iconic and practical pieces of military equipment in history, the papilio, the legionary's tent. This wasn't just a simple shelter. It was a mobile barracks block, the physical embodiment of the army's incredible logistical prowess and the contubernium's portable home. When the legion marched, the entire fort packed up and moved with it, and the heart of that traveling community was the leather tent shared by those same 8 men. The construction of the papilio was a masterpiece of functional design. It was a heavy, durable structure made from layers of leather, most likely ox or goat hide, which were treated with oil or wax to make them waterproof. Unfolded, it formed a large, rounded panel that, when draped over a central pole and staked down at the corners, created a familiar-looking bell-shaped shelter. This design was brilliantly effective. The leather was thick enough to resist wind and rain, and the single central pole made for a relatively simple and quick setup. The 8 men of the contubernium would share one of these tents, sleeping head to toe in a circle around the central pole, their personal kits stored carefully around the edges. Every item had its place because every item had to be carried. The weight of this mobile home was substantial. The leather alone could weigh over 40 pounds, and when you added the wooden poles, pegs, and the heavy millstone the group used for grinding grain, the combined load for the tent and its components was a significant burden. This is where the army's famous mule comes into the picture. Each contubernium was assigned a mule, a humble but utterly essential member of the team. This animal carried the tent, the milling equipment, and other heavy communal gear, freeing the soldiers to carry their own personal armor, weapons, and marching pack. The routine surrounding the papilio reveals the relentless, machine-like efficiency of the Roman army on the move. At the end of a grueling day's march, which could cover 20 Roman miles in full kit, the soldiers' work was far from over. The moment the command was given to make camp, a well-rehearsed ballet of labor began. The entire contubernium would swing into action. Some men would begin clearing the ground of rocks and debris within their assigned plot, while others would unpack the mule and assemble the tent. Driving the central pole, draping the heavy leather over it, and hammering the stout wooden pegs into the hard ground was a team effort. Speed was critical. This entire process of building a fortified camp from scratch, complete with a defensive ditch and rampart, was expected to be completed in a matter of hours. As the tents rose in neat, orderly rows across the landscape, the temporary camp began to mirror the layout of a permanent fort, with streets, a headquarters tent, and the commander's quarters. Inside the Papilio, the space was just as functional and cramped as their barrack room back home. The air would be thick with the smell of leather, sweat, and the smoke from a small, carefully managed cooking fire outside the entrance. Here, the same rituals of food preparation unfolded: the grinding of grain, the baking of bread on a hot stone. The tent was a pocket of familiar routine in an unfamiliar and often dangerous land. It provided not just physical shelter from the elements, but a profound psychological comfort. After a day spent marching through unknown forests or across enemy-held plains, the 8 men could retreat into their own small, leather-walled world, a tiny piece of Roman order in the midst of chaos. This ability to create a standardized, secure, and organized living space anywhere, night after night, was a key component of Roman military dominance. It meant the army was never truly exposed. It could operate year-round in any terrain, without relying on vulnerable supply lines or finding friendly villages for shelter. The enemy, watching from a distance, would see a fully functional Roman fort materialize on the horizon before sunset, a clear demonstration of an institutional discipline they could scarcely comprehend. The Papilio, therefore, was more than a piece of equipment. It was a symbol of the army's self-sufficiency and its relentless, grinding momentum. It allowed the culture of the contubernium, the shared meals, the mutual dependence, the unbreakable bonds, to persist uninterrupted, whether stationed on a windswept British frontier or campaigning deep in the German forests. The legionaries' home was not a place on a map. It was this group of 8 men and the leather tent they carried with them. Yet, even with the profound bonds of the contubernium and the protection of fortress walls, life on the frontier was brutally unforgiving. A soldier faced dangers far beyond the battlefield: infection from a minor cut, a broken leg from a fall during drill, or a virulent fever sweeping through the crowded barracks could be just as deadly as an enemy's spear. It was for this grim reality that the Roman army maintained one of its most remarkable and advanced institutions, the valetudinarium. This was not a primitive sick bay. It was a sophisticated, purpose-built military hospital, a testament to the immense practical value Rome placed on its human fighting force. Think of the staggering investment. A legion represented years of training, tons of customized equipment, and a steady salary for 25 years. Allowing a highly trained soldier to die from a preventable illness was seen as a catastrophic waste of resources. The valetudinarium was the army's answer, a state-funded healthcare system designed to conserve its most vital asset, the legionary himself. Walking into one of these hospitals, you would be struck by its familiar, logical layout. Excavations at forts like Nova on the Danube and Vindolanda in Britain reveal a building designed with a clear, almost modern understanding of medical needs. It was typically a rectangular courtyard building, ensuring good light and ventilation for the patients. The interior was organized around a central colonnaded walkway, which provided a covered, peaceful space for convalescing soldiers to take the air. Opening off this central corridor were a series of small wards, each holding perhaps 4 to 6 men. This small ward system was a brilliant innovation. It helped prevent the rapid spread of infection that would have been inevitable in a single, large, open hall. The building also contains specialized rooms that speak to a highly developed medical practice. There was a dedicated operating theater where surgeons could set bones and perform amputations in a clean, well-lit space. A separate kitchen prepared special diets for the sick and wounded, and there was even evidence of latrines and a bath suite, underscoring the Roman belief in hygiene as a cornerstone of recovery. The men who worked in these hospitals were not battlefield medics dragging wounded men to safety. They were the medici, a corps of highly trained professionals. At the top was the medicus ordinarius, the chief medical officer, who was often a Greek physician with formal training in the theories of Galen and Hippocrates. Beneath him served junior doctors, orderlies, and the capsarii, who were responsible for the initial bandaging of wounds on the field. These medici possessed a startling array of specialized tools that would look perfectly at home in a modern surgical tray. Archaeological finds include beautifully crafted bronze and iron scalpels with replaceable steel blades, bone levers for setting fractures, intricate forceps for removing arrowheads, and catheters for relieving blockages. They had vaginal speculums for examinations and a terrifying device called a valselle, a claw-like instrument used for extracting polyps. Perhaps most impressive of all were their sophisticated arrow spoons and extractors, ingeniously designed to safely remove a barbed projectile without causing further catastrophic damage to the tissue. The treatments administered were a fascinating and sometimes effective mix of practical wisdom and ancient theory. The medici understood the principles of sterilization better than any other society for the next 1500 years. They boiled their instruments and used vinegar as a disinfectant for wounds. They used opium poppy extract and mandrake root as powerful anesthetics to sedate patients during agonizing procedures like amputations. They sutured wounds with linen thread and used honey, a natural antibacterial agent, to pack injuries and prevent infection. Their pharmacopoeia was vast, drawing on herbs and minerals from across the empire. A military diploma, a sort of doctor's notepad found at Vindolanda, lists prescriptions for everything from eye ointments to digestive remedies. While their understanding of germ theory was millennia away, their empirical approach, meticulous record keeping, and emphasis on clean facilities and proper diet gave Roman soldiers a far better chance of survival than any of their adversaries. The existence of the valetudinarium reveals a cold, pragmatic calculus. A soldier healed was a soldier who could return to the ranks, preserving the army's fighting strength and saving the state the enormous cost of recruiting and training a replacement. But for the individual legionary lying in one of those small wards, it was something far more personal. It was a promise, a declaration that his life, and his ability to one day return to his contubernium, was worth every ounce of the empire's considerable effort and ingenuity. But beyond the hospital and the barracks lay another critical sector of the fort, one that rang with the sound of hammers and smelled of smoke and hot metal. To truly grasp the legion's genius, we must step into the fabrici, the sprawling workshops that transformed a military garrison into a self-sufficient industrial hub. We often picture the Roman soldier only as a fighter, but the legions were just as much a mobile corporation of engineers, artisans, and manufacturers. Their ability to produce, maintain, and repair everything they needed on site was a logistical advantage that no contemporary army could match. A Roman fort wasn't just a place for soldiers to live. It was a factory for war, a place where raw materials were transformed into the tools of empire, ensuring the legion could operate independently for years, even when cut off from distant supply lines. The most vital and dramatic of these workshops was undoubtedly the blacksmith's forge. The constant rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil was the soundtrack of military readiness. Here, teams of highly skilled smiths, who were often soldiers themselves trained in the craft, worked in shifts to keep the army armed. Their primary task was maintenance. A soldier's gladius, his short stabbing sword, required constant sharpening and repair. The iron hobnails on his sandals, the caligae, wore down quickly on long marches and needed frequent replacement. But their work went far beyond simple upkeep. These forges were also manufacturing centers, producing new spearheads, arrowheads, and the intricate components of the legionaries' iconic segmented armor, the lorica segmentata. Creating this armor was a feat of precision metalworking. Each individual steel plate had to be curved to fit the body perfectly, with brass hinges and leather straps carefully attached to allow for mobility. The smiths had to repeatedly heat hammer and quench the metal to achieve the perfect balance of hardness and flexibility. A single suit of armor represented dozens of hours of skilled labor, all performed within the fort's walls. The scale of production was immense. A single legion of around 5,000 men would require thousands of new nails, hundreds of new spears, and a constant stream of repaired swords and armor plates. The glow of the forge fires, therefore, was more than just light. It was the visible sign of the legion's enduring power to rearm and sustain itself. Just as essential, though far less glamorous, was the work of the leatherworkers. If the blacksmiths armed the soldier, the leatherworkers clothed and equipped him. Their workshop would have been filled with the pungent smell of tanning solutions and piles of hides. From these raw materials, they crafted an astonishing array of essential gear. Every soldier relied on his leather military belt, the balteus, a heavy, studded item that was a powerful symbol of his identity. They produced the sturdy caligae sandals, with their thick leather soles pierced for the hobnails. They fashioned the protective aprons made of leather strips that hung from the belt. Perhaps their most crucial and complex products were the tents. As we discussed, each 8-man squad carried a large leather papilio. These tents underwent constant wear and tear from weather, transport, and setup. The leatherworkers were responsible for treating the hides with wax or oil to keep them waterproof, and for patching any rips or tears that could leave a contubernium exposed to the elements. This was not just craft. It was a direct contribution to the army's mobility and the soldiers' basic comfort and survival. And then there were the carpenters, the masters of wood who provided the skeleton for the Roman war machine. Their domain was a vast, open-sided shed filled with the scent of fresh cut timber and the sounds of sawing and planing. The carpenter's work was incredibly diverse. On a basic level, they were responsible for all the fort's wooden infrastructure, repairing barrack walls, maintaining the rampart walkways, and fabricating doors and furniture. But their most spectacular contributions were the heavy siege engines that gave the Romans their unparalleled advantage in assaulting fortified positions. Building a massive ballista or an onager, a giant catapult that could hurl a stone ball weighing 50 pounds or more, required incredible skill and precision. These were not crude devices. They were complex machines of torsion and leverage, with frames built from massive, carefully jointed timbers. The carpenters had to follow standardized designs and measurements to ensure that every component was interchangeable, allowing for repairs in the field. When the legion was on campaign, the carpenters would travel with it, bringing their tools and a supply of pre-shaped components so they could assemble these engines of destruction wherever they were needed. The ability to build a trebuchet or a siege tower on the spot, using local timber and their own expertise, meant that no enemy wall was ever truly safe. This integrated network of workshops made the Roman legion a truly self-contained force. It eliminated the need for long, vulnerable supply chains for everything except the most basic raw materials like iron ore and unworked leather. A legion could arrive in a new territory and, using the resources at hand, begin building its fort, manufacturing its weapons, and repairing its equipment from day one. This industrial capacity was a force multiplier of immense proportions. It meant that losses in battle could be quickly replaced. It meant that a long campaign did not inevitably lead to an army becoming progressively more ragged and poorly equipped. The soldier knew that the system supporting him was robust and ever-present, right there in his own home base. The fabrici were the ultimate expression of Roman pragmatism. They understood that victory was not just won by bravery on the battlefield, but by the cumulative effort of the smith's hammer, the leatherworker's needle, and the carpenter's saw, all working in relentless, coordinated harmony within the safety of the barracks walls. And just as the blacksmith's forge armed the legion and the workshops equipped it, there was one building in the fort whose contents were arguably even more vital to survival than swords or spears: the Harium, the legionary granary. While the Principia held the legion's soul and the barracks its heart, the granary was its stomach, a colossal storehouse that guaranteed the army would not be defeated by the oldest enemy of all, starvation. Feeding a force of 5,000 men, plus their cavalry horses, pack mules, and the various other animals attached to the legion, was a logistical challenge of breathtaking scale. Think about the sheer volume of food required. The backbone of the Roman soldier's diet was grain, primarily wheat. Each man was entitled to a monthly ration of around 30 to 40 kilograms of wheat. Do the math for a full legion, and you're looking at a staggering 150 to 200 tons of grain consumed every single month. This wasn't a supply that could be left to chance or reliant on weekly deliveries from the local countryside, which might be hostile or barren. The legion had to be self-sufficient for months at a time, and the Harium was the masterpiece of engineering that made this possible. The design of these granaries was a brilliant response to the primary threat to any large grain store: moisture and pests. From the outside, a Harium was an imposing, long, rectangular building with massively thick stone walls, but its most ingenious feature was hidden at its base. The entire structure was built on a series of low, closely spaced pillars or dwarf walls, creating a raised hypocaust floor not unlike those used in Roman bathhouses. This elevated stone floor was punctuated with numerous ventilation holes. The purpose of this was simple yet revolutionary. By lifting the massive grain supply off the damp ground and allowing a constant flow of air to circulate beneath it, Roman engineers could drastically reduce the rot and mildew that would otherwise destroy the entire supply. It was ancient climate control at its most effective. Inside, the space was a vast, open hall, often divided into bays to hold different types of grain or other dry goods like beans, lentils, and salt. The walls were often buttressed from the outside to support the immense outward pressure exerted by thousands of tons of stored grain. The roof was high and steeply pitched, and the windows were small, narrow, and placed high up on the walls, a design that further promoted air circulation while keeping out direct sunlight and making it difficult for thieves, both human and animal, to gain entry. The operation of the Harium was a testament to the army's bureaucratic mind. This was not a chaotic heap of sacks. It was a meticulously managed inventory. Grain would arrive at the fort, often transported by barge along rivers or by carts in massive supply trains. It would be carefully measured out by clerks, its quality checked, and then recorded on wax tablets or papyrus ledgers before being poured into the storage bays. The quartermaster, an officer of significant responsibility, knew to the pound how much grain was in the granary, what its rate of consumption was, and when the next shipment was due. This allowed for precise planning that could span an entire year. The grain ration was so central to a soldier's life that it was effectively a form of currency. While he received a monetary salary, a significant portion of his pay was deducted upfront for his food, clothing, and equipment. This system guaranteed that every man was fed, eliminating the uncertainty that could lead to mutiny. 3 times a day, the soldiers of each contubernium would draw their portion of grain from the granary, taking it back to their barrack room to be ground by hand into flour and baked into the hardtack-style bread that was the true staff of life. But the granary's role extended far beyond just feeding the men. The Roman war machine ran on horsepower. The cavalry, the scouts, and the all-important baggage train of mules all required enormous quantities of fodder oats, barley, and hay. A single cavalry horse could easily consume over 10 kilograms of fodder per day. Multiply that by hundreds of horses and mules, and the harem complex had to store mountains of animal feed as well. The ability to sustain its animals was as critical as feeding its soldiers. Without its cavalry and transport mules, the legion would be immobilized and blind. This holistic approach to supply, seeing the needs of men and beasts as 2 parts of a single, integrated system, is what set the Roman army apart. The quiet, cool, dark interior of the harem, with the air whispering through the vents beneath the towering stacks of grain, represented something profound. It was the absolute foundation of Roman military power. It was the confidence that enabled a general to plan a campaign deep into enemy territory, knowing his army would not dissolve from hunger before a single battle was fought. The granary was the ultimate symbol of long-term planning, a physical promise that the empire would sustain its own, turning the raw potential of wheat and barley into the enduring strength of its legions. Now, let us move from the industrial clamor of the workshops and the practical bulk of the granaries to a place of quiet authority and refined luxury, a world away from the cramped contubernium. Positioned in the most prestigious part of the fort, often directly adjacent to the Principia, stood the praetorium. This was not merely the commander's quarters. It was a statement in stone and tile, a powerful declaration of social order and Roman identity planted firmly on the barbarian frontier. While the Centurions' house displayed the rewards of seasoned command, the praetorium was something else entirely, the private villa of the legionary commander, often a legate from the senatorial class, and it was designed to replicate the comforts and culture of Rome itself, no matter how distant the posting. Stepping across its threshold was to leave the military base behind and enter the world of a Roman aristocrat. You would first find yourself in a traditional atrium, the grand reception hall that was the centerpiece of any elite Roman home. Here, the sounds of marching feet and shouted commands were replaced by the gentle splash of water in an impluvium, a sunken pool in the center of the floor that collected rainwater from an opening in the roof above. This space was designed for prestige and the important social ritual of the morning salutatio, where the commander would receive guests, petitioners, and his senior officers. The walls would have been brightly painted with elaborate frescoes, perhaps scenes from mythology or lush garden landscapes, a vivid splash of color and sophistication against the gray northern skies. The floor was likely a beautiful mosaic of colored tesserae, a stark contrast to the wooden planks or packed earth of the barracks. Beyond the public formality of the atrium lay the private heart of the home, arranged around a peaceful peristyle garden. This colonnaded courtyard, open to the sky and filled with fragrant herbs, flowering plants, and perhaps even a small fountain, was the family's outdoor living room. It provided light, air, and a profound sense of peace and privacy, a sanctuary for the commander and his family away from the constant demands of his troops. The rooms opening onto this garden were a suite of domestic comforts unimaginable to the common soldier. There was a private bath suite, complete with a warm tepidarium, a hot caldarium, and a refreshing frigidarium. This meant the commander and his household could enjoy the quintessential Roman luxury of the baths without ever leaving their home, without having to mix with the rank and file in the fort's public bathhouse. A dedicated dining room, the triclinium, was furnished with the 3 couches for reclining during elaborate evening meals. Here, the commander would host elaborate dinner parties for his officers or important local dignitaries, serving food on fine imported pottery and wine in delicate glass vessels, all part of maintaining the social and political networks that were essential to his career. The presence of this luxurious residence served multiple, crucial purposes beyond simple comfort. For the commander, a man born into the highest echelons of Roman society, the praetorium was a psychological anchor. It prevented him from feeling like an exile in a foreign land, allowing him to maintain the lifestyle, culture, and values he was born to. This was vital for morale and for ensuring that Rome's elite would willingly take on these demanding frontier commands. Furthermore, the house was a tool of diplomacy. Its splendor was meant to impress. When tribal chieftains from beyond the frontier were invited for an audience, they weren't received in a Spartan office. They were led through a home that screamed of Rome's immense wealth, power, and sophisticated culture. The message was clear. The civilization this commander represents is advanced, powerful, and built on a scale you cannot hope to match. The praetorium, therefore, was more than a home. It was a piece of Rome itself, a deliberate projection of soft power that reinforced the hard power of the legions stationed just outside its walls. But after the relentless discipline of the drill field and the complex industry of the workshops, the Roman soldier's day held one universally anticipated destination: the thermae, the military bathhouse. This was far more than just a place to get clean. It was a sanctuary for the body and the spirit, a cornerstone of Roman culture replicated on every frontier. Imagine a sprawling, steamy complex, its roof echoing with the sounds of splashing water, loud conversation, and the laughter of men finally off duty. For a legionary, stepping into the bathhouse was like stepping back into the civilized world, a daily ritual that washed away not just the grime of labor, but the immense psychological weight of military service. The experience was a carefully orchestrated journey through temperature and sensation. You would begin in the apoditerium, the changing room. Here, you would strip off your tunic and sandals, storing your belongings in a small, niche-like locker. The air was already warmer, a prelude to the heat to come. From there, you would proceed not into scalding water, but into the tepidarium. This was the warm room, gently heated by the hypocaust system, a network of hollow spaces under the floor and inside the walls through which hot air from a central furnace would circulate. The warmth here was not oppressive, but enveloping, designed to prepare your body gradually for the higher temperatures ahead. You would sit on the warm marble benches, feeling the muscles in your back and legs begin to loosen, the sweat starting to bead on your skin as you chatted with the men from your contubernium or other centuries. Next came the main event, the caldarium. Pushing open the heavy door to this room was like entering another world. The heat hit you in a thick, moist wave, the air hazy with steam rising from a large, shallow pool of hot water. This was the hottest room in the complex, its temperature intensified by the hypocaust system, heating the floor to the point where you might need to wear wooden sandals to avoid burning your feet. Here, the real work of cleaning happened. You would sit and sweat profusely, opening the pores and softening the dirt and oil ground into your skin. Then you would use a strigil, a curved metal tool, to scrape away the sweat, grime, and oil. You might have a slave to do this for you, or you would trade the service with a friend from your unit. After being scraped clean, you could then sink into the hot pool, the near scalding water providing a deep, penetrating heat that soothed aching muscles and tired joints. The caldarium was a place of intense physical relief, a blissful counterpoint to the hard physical labor and marching that defined a soldier's existence. But the ritual was not complete without its final, bracing phase. From the overwhelming heat of the caldarium, you would move to the frigidarium, the cold room. This space was dominated by a large, refreshingly cold plunge pool. Taking the plunge was a shock to the system, a sudden, gasping immersion that closed the pores, invigorated the body, and left you feeling truly awake and clean. This cycle of hot and cold was believed to be essential for good health, balancing the body's humors and promoting circulation. Beyond the main rooms, a larger bath complex might also include a laconicum, an intensely hot, dry sweat room similar to a modern sauna, and most importantly, the palaestra. This was an open courtyard for exercise, where soldiers could wrestle, play ball games, or lift weights before their bath, turning the entire visit into a comprehensive workout and cleansing routine. The true magic of the bathhouse, however, lay in its function as the fort's primary social hub. This was the closest equivalent to a modern-day community center, pub, and gym all rolled into one. Within these warm, echoing halls, the rigid hierarchy of the military could, for a few precious hours, soften. A low-ranking soldier might find himself exercising next to a centurion in the palaestra, or sharing a bench in the tepidarium with a clerk from the Principia. Conversations flowed as freely as the water. Men would discuss everything from the day's duties and rumors from other parts of the empire to personal stories and hopes for life after the army. Games were played like latrunculi, a complex Roman strategy game similar to chess, with soldiers hunched over boards, gambling small sums of money and shouting encouragement to one another. Food and drink vendors would circulate, selling snacks and cups of wine. In this communal, egalitarian space, the bonds of the contubernium were strengthened, and new friendships were forged across unit lines. It was a vital pressure valve, a place where the immense stresses of frontier life could be released through simple human connection and relaxation. The bathhouse, therefore, was not a luxury. It was a non-negotiable part of the Roman military machine, as crucial to maintaining morale and unit cohesion as the granary was to maintaining caloric intake. It reaffirmed a soldier's identity not just as a fighter, but as a Roman, a man who participated in the civilized rituals of his culture, no matter how far from home he was stationed. Yet for all the social respite of the baths and the industrial might of the workshops, the ultimate purpose of the entire fortress was housed in one of its most secure and sobering structures, the armamentarium. This was the legion's arsenal, a heavily guarded repository where the tools of war were stored, maintained, and meticulously accounted for. If the Principia was the brain and the barracks the heart, then the armamentarium was the clenched fist of the fort, a constant, vigilant reminder of the violence that underpinned Roman power. Stepping inside was to enter a world of ordered lethality, where every item had a designated place and every movement was governed by strict procedure. The building itself was designed for one primary function: security. It was typically a long, rectangular hall with massively thick stone walls and a heavily barred single entrance. The windows, if there were any, were small, narrow slits set high up on the walls, making them impossible to climb through. At night, the doors would be sealed with a complex lock, and the watchwords for the guards stationed outside would be carefully rotated. This wasn't just to prevent theft. It was to prevent any possibility of a local rebellion or a mutiny from within gaining access to the Legion's own weaponry. The security was so absolute that even the soldiers themselves were largely kept out, only entering under direct supervision to draw or return their gear. Inside, the atmosphere was one of stark functionality. The air would have carried the distinctive sense of oiled metal, seasoned wood, and old leather. Instead of the chaotic clutter one might imagine, the space was a model of military organization. Along the walls, and in freestanding racks throughout the hall, were the instruments that made the Legion unstoppable. The most dominant feature would have been the long, orderly racks holding the legionary's signature shield, the scutum. These were not lightweight items. A curved, rectangular scutum was a heavy piece of equipment, constructed from laminated wood and covered in leather, with a heavy iron boss at its center. Storing them properly was crucial to prevent the wood from warping. They were likely stored upright in specially designed cradles, their distinctive red emblems the lightning bolts of Jupiter or the wings of victory facing inward, a silent, colorful army waiting to be unleashed. Nearby, in separate, specialized racks, stood the killing tools. The gladius, the soldier's short, double-edged stabbing sword, was the very symbol of Roman military might. These were not stored in loose piles. Each sword would have been housed in its own space on a rack, its scabbard securely fastened, ensuring the blade remained straight and the edge protected. The system allowed for an instant visual inventory. An empty slot was a glaring anomaly that demanded immediate explanation. Then there were the pila, the formidable javelins. These were stored in large, vertical stands, their heavy iron shanks and long wooden shafts held firmly in place. The design of the pilum, with its thin, pyramidal point on a soft iron shank, was meant to bend upon impact, making it impossible for an enemy to throw back. Seeing hundreds of them lined up in perfect order was a sight that communicated both precision and overwhelming force. But the armamentarium was far more than a static warehouse. It was a place of constant, careful maintenance, a ritual as important as any drill. Weapons and armor were not simply issued and forgotten. They were the soldier's personal responsibility, a multi-year loan from the state that he was required to keep in perfect condition. The process of returning equipment was a formal inspection. After a training exercise or a patrol, a soldier would present his gear to the armamentarium clerks and the specialized immune soldiers with craft skills exempt from fatigues, who worked as armorers. A gladius with a rusty spot or a nicked edge would be noted. A scutum with a cracked rim or a loose grip would be flagged for repair. The soldier might be assigned extra duties or face a pay deduction for negligence. This system of accountability ensured that the entire Legion's equipment was always in a state of immediate readiness. The armorers themselves were constantly at work in a designated section of the building or an adjacent workshop. They had whetstones for sharpening blades, polishing stones for the scutum's metal boss, and vats of oil for treating leather straps and protecting metal from the corrosive frontier damp. They would straighten bent pilum shanks, replace broken spear shafts, and stitch new layers of leather onto worn-out shield covers. The armamentarium was therefore a living system, a cycle of issue, use, inspection, and maintenance that never ceased. The moment of issue, especially on the eve of a campaign or in response to a sudden alarm, was a scene of controlled, urgent efficiency. When the call came, the soldiers of a century would line up in the street outside the armamentarium. They would not rush in and grab whatever was closest. Instead, the process was managed by the optio, the centurion's second in command, working from his roster. Each man's equipment was recorded, and he would be issued the specific gladius, scutum, and pilum that were his to maintain. This method prevented the chaos of men scrambling for the best-looking gear, and ensured that every piece of equipment remained traceable to a single, responsible individual. The sound of this process was the clatter of wood and metal, the bark of names from the roster, and the shuffling of hundreds of sandaled feet on the stone paving. For the soldier, the weight of the scutum slung over his back, the familiar grip of his gladius in his hand, and the balance of the pilum were the final, tangible transformation from citizen to legionary. Stepping out of the dim, orderly silence of the armamentarium and into the daylight, he was no longer just a resident of the fort. He was now an active component of its ultimate, violent purpose. The arsenal was the final, crucial link in the chain, the point where the fort's industry, logistics, and discipline converged into the direct application of force. And of course, the mighty Roman war machine depended on far more than just its human strength. Its speed, its logistical reach, and its crushing power on the battlefield were all propelled by the tireless work of its animals. Tucked away in their own dedicated section of the fort, the stables housed the living, breathing engines of the legion, the cavalry's powerful horses, and the baggage train's sturdy mules. These structures were not dark, squalid sheds. They were carefully designed facilities that reflected the immense practical value Rome placed on its four-legged soldiers. A single legion could have over 1,000 horses and mules attached to it, and the health of these animals was not a matter of sentimentality, but one of absolute military necessity. A lame cavalry horse could mean a lost scout or a failed flanking maneuver. A sick mule could mean a stranded contubernium without its tent or milling equipment. The entire system of supply and mobile warfare would grind to a halt without them, so their housing and care were engineered with the same precision as the granaries or the workshops. The stable itself was a long, rectangular building, often built with stone foundations and a timber superstructure, very similar in appearance to the infantry barracks. But its internal layout was specifically tailored to the needs of the animals and the soldiers who cared for them. The most ingenious feature was the floor. Instead of being solid and flat, it was typically sunken, with a central, slightly sloped drainage channel running the entire length of the building. On either side of this channel were low, continuous stone mangers for feed and water. This design made the daily, messy chore of mucking out incredibly efficient. A soldier could simply sweep soiled straw and waste directly into the central drain, where water could be sluiced through to carry it away outside the building. This focus on hygiene was critical for preventing the spread of disease and hoof rot, especially in the damp climates of Northern Europe. The animals were tethered in a long line, each with its own allocated space, allowing the mulians, the mule drivers, and the cavalrymen to move easily down the line to feed, water, and groom their charges. The air inside would have been thick with the warm, earthy smells of hay, horse, and leather. a familiar and comforting scent to the men whose lives were intertwined with these creatures. The care these animals received went far beyond basic shelter and food. The Roman army employed a corps of highly skilled veterinarians, known as veterinarii, who were as dedicated to animal health as the medici were to human soldiers. These men were not mere horse handlers. They were trained professionals with a deep understanding of equine anatomy and medicine. Their knowledge was a combination of inherited wisdom, practical experience, and written texts, such as the works of writers like Vegetius, who dedicated entire sections to the care and treatment of cavalry horses. The veterinarii would conduct regular inspections, checking for lameness, signs of colic, hoof ailments, and saddle sores. They possessed a sophisticated array of tools for their work, including specialized firing irons used for cauterizing wounds, probes for cleaning and treating hoof abscesses, and various types of forceps and knives for minor surgeries. They prepared complex poultices from herbs and minerals to reduce swelling, and they understood the importance of proper diet and dental care for maintaining an animal's condition over years of hard service. For the cavalryman, his horse was his most vital piece of equipment and his closest companion. The relationship between a trooper and his mount was one of profound interdependence. He was responsible for its daily grooming, for ensuring its tack was in good repair, and for building the trust required to charge into the chaos of battle. A well-trained warhorse was a formidable asset in its own right, taught to kick, bite, and trample enemy infantry on command. The loss of a horse in combat was not just a logistical setback. For the cavalryman, it was a personal tragedy and a severe blow to his effectiveness. Similarly, the muleteers developed a deep appreciation for the stoic endurance of their animals. A mule could carry well over 200 pounds of equipment tents, milling stones, siege engine components day after day over the roughest terrain. The army's ability to move and sustain itself was quite literally carried on the backs of these unsung heroes. The stables, therefore, were not a peripheral part of the fort. They were a hub of constant, vital activity. The snort of a horse, the bray of a mule, and the busy sounds of soldiers and veterinarians at work were the sounds of the legion's mobility and power, a reminder that the empire was built on the strength of both man and beast. Moving from the stables and the bustling activity of the main fort, we now come to a facility that, while less celebrated, was absolutely fundamental to the health and functioning of the entire garrison, the communal latrines. It's easy to overlook this aspect of daily life, but for the Roman military, sanitation was not a matter of convenience. It was a strategic imperative. Keeping thousands of men healthy in close quarters required a sophisticated approach to waste management, and the solutions they engineered were centuries ahead of their time. A Roman fort's latrine was a marvel of practical hydraulic engineering, a space that, despite its function, demonstrated a profound understanding of public health that would not be matched again in Europe for over 1,000 years. The typical military latrine was a long, rectangular room, often located near the bathhouse to easily tap into its water supply. Stepping inside, you would be struck by its efficient, almost institutional design. Running along 2 or 3 of the walls was a continuous stone bench, punctuated by a series of keyhole-shaped openings cut at regular intervals. This was the famous multi-seat design, allowing dozens of soldiers to use the facility at once. There was no concept of privacy in the modern sense. This was a communal, social activity. Soldiers would sit side by side, perhaps discussing the day's duties or sharing rumors, much as they did in the baths. The benches themselves were not made of cold, rough stone. They were often capped with smooth, carefully fitted wooden seats, a small but significant comfort that made the daily routine more bearable, especially in a cold northern climate. Beneath this bench lay the true genius of the system. A constant, shallow stream of fresh water flowed in a channel directly beneath each row of openings, carrying waste away from the fort and into a main sewer that would discharge into a river or a large septic tank far beyond the walls. This was not a sporadic flushing mechanism. It was a perpetual flow, engineered through a clever gravitational design. The water was typically diverted from the fort's main aqueduct or from a large holding tank that collected rainwater. The engineers would ensure the channel had a slight, consistent slope, using gravity to keep the water moving steadily and preventing any stagnant buildup. This running water system was the cornerstone of Roman military sanitation, a brilliant method for managing waste on an industrial scale that directly contributed to the legion's low disease rates compared to their adversaries. Now, this leads us to the most infamous and often misunderstood aspect of Roman latrine hygiene, the communal sponge on a stick, known as a xylospongium. Mounted on the wall within easy reach of every seated soldier was a bucket of salt water or vinegar water. In it rested several of these sponges, each attached to a long wooden handle. After finishing his business, a soldier would use this sponge like a modern toilet brush or wipe, clean himself, and then simply rinse the sponge in the running water channel beneath him before placing it back in the bucket for the next person. While this practice seems shocking and unhygienic to us today, it was, in the context of the ancient world, a systematic and relatively effective method of cleanliness. The acidic or saline solution in the bucket would have provided a basic level of disinfection, and the running water offered a rinsing mechanism. It was a shared tool for a shared space, reflecting a different cultural attitude toward privacy and communal living. The entire latrine complex, from the flowing water to the design of the seats, served one overarching purpose: disease prevention. In any large, concentrated population, human waste is a primary vector for deadly pathogens like typhoid, cholera, and dysentery. By systematically and continuously removing this waste from the living environment, Roman military engineers were unknowingly practicing a form of preventative medicine. They understood the correlation between cleanliness and health, even if they did not comprehend the germ theory that would explain it. The latrine, therefore, was not a dirty place in the Roman mind. It was a clean, orderly, and essential facility. Its existence meant that the fort's streets, alleyways, and water sources were not contaminated, protecting the soldiers from the invisible enemies that could decimate an army far more effectively than any barbarian horde. This advanced sanitation was a quiet, daily victory for Roman logistics, a routine engineering feat that safeguarded the fighting strength of the legion and stood as a powerful testament to their commitment to maintaining a healthy, operable fighting force, no matter where in the world they were stationed. Returning to the heart of the Principia, we must now pass beyond the central courtyard and step into the immense, echoing space of the Basilica, the administrative and judicial powerhouse of the legion. While the courtyard outside bustled with the movement of men, the Basilica hummed with the focused energy of bureaucracy itself. This was not merely a large room. It was a monumental hall, its soaring roof supported by rows of tall columns, designed to inspire awe and reinforce the absolute authority of Roman law and military order. The sheer scale of this interior space was a deliberate psychological tool. When a soldier was summoned to stand before his commander in this hall, the vastness of the room and the commanding figure seated at the far end on a raised tribunal platform made the individual feel small, reinforcing the immense power structure of which he was a single, disciplined part. This grand hall served a triple purpose. It was a place for legal proceedings, for large indoor assemblies when the harsh northern weather made the courtyard impractical, and most critically, it was the central processing hub for the mountain of paperwork that kept the Legion functioning. Flanking this great hall, often separated by wooden screens or arranged in a gallery overlooking the main floor, were the rows of administrative offices. This was where the Legion's memory lived, a warren of small rooms occupied by the Army's true unsung heroes, the clerks, scribes, and accountants. These men, known as legionary or exacti, were often soldiers themselves, chosen for their literacy and numerical skill, and granted the status of immunes, exempt from heavy labor and guard duties. Their work was relentless and meticulous. In one office, a team of scribes would be hunched over wooden writing tablets and scrolls of papyrus, their reed pens scratching constantly as they transcribed daily reports from each century. They recorded everything: strength returns detailing the number of men present, sick, or on detached duty, inventory lists of equipment drawn from the armamentarium, and requisition orders for supplies from the granary. The sound in these rooms was a quiet symphony of shuffling paper, the gentle clink of wax seals being applied, and the low murmur of clerks cross-referencing information. The sheer volume of this documentation was staggering. A single legion generated enough paperwork to require its own dedicated archives, and the survival of waterlogged documents from places like Vindolanda gives us a breathtakingly detailed window into this world. We have slips of wood requesting leave for a soldier to visit a nearby fort, birthday party invitations between officers' wives, and even reports on the dire condition of the local roads. The most vital of all these records were the personnel files. Every soldier who ever served in a Roman legion had his life meticulously documented from the day he enlisted. A clerk would open a file on a new recruit, noting his name, age, place of origin, physical description, and the names of his parents. This file would follow him throughout his entire 25-year career. It logged every promotion, every pay statement with its detailed deductions for food, boots, and his burial club subscription, and every award for valor or instance of disciplinary action. When he was transferred to a different unit, his file was updated and sent on. When he was honorably discharged, this comprehensive record was the basis for his pension and grant of citizenship. This system meant that the commander, at a glance, could know the complete service history of any man under his command. It was the ultimate tool of personnel management, transforming thousands of individuals into a perfectly tracked, highly organized human resource. The accountants working in adjacent offices performed an equally monumental task. They were responsible for the Legion's entire financial ecosystem, from the vast sums in the underground strongroom to the individual copper coins in a soldier's purse. They managed the pay chest, ensuring that the exact amount of silver denarii was on hand for the triennial pay parade. They handled the complex accounts for the sale of goods produced by the Legion's workshops and oversaw the budgeting for large-scale projects like the construction of a new bathhouse or the repair of a fortress wall. Their ledgers balanced the immense cost of the Legion against the resources of the province, a continuous exercise in fiscal control that ensured the army was not just a fighting force, but a financially self-sustaining entity. The existence of this vast, paper-driven bureaucracy was a cornerstone of Roman military dominance. It created a system of accountability and predictability that their adversaries simply could not match. A tribal warlord might lead a fearsome warband, but he could only guess at his exact numbers and supplies. The Roman commander, by contrast, could consult his records and know with certainty how many men were fit for duty, how many swords were in the armory, how much grain was in the granary, and exactly how much money was in his coffers. This administrative machine eliminated the chaos and uncertainty that had plagued armies for millennia. It allowed for long-term planning, the efficient allocation of resources, and the creation of a professional military culture where a soldier's service and sacrifice were formally recognized and recorded for posterity. The quiet, diligent work of the scribes in those small, parchment-filled offices was, in its own way, as vital to the empire's security as the centurion's sword. They turned the chaotic raw data of military life into actionable intelligence, providing the commander with the clarity and control he needed to project Roman power from the deserts of Africa to the misty highlands of Scotland. But beyond the administrative bustle of the basilica, behind the commander's tribunal, lay a chamber of such profound spiritual gravity that its silence was more powerful than any shouted command. This was the Eads or Sacellum, the sacred shrine of the legion, and stepping into this space was to enter the very soul of the military community. The air here was still and heavy with the scent of incense and burning lamp oil, a stark contrast to the bustling courtyard just outside. Light would have filtered in sparingly, perhaps from a single high window, catching the glint of gold and polished metal in the gloom. This was not a public temple for the masses. It was an intensely private sanctuary for the unit, the spiritual anchor that bound every man, from the lowliest recruit to the legate himself, to a shared divine purpose. Within this secure, hallowed space, the legion's identity was not just recorded on papyrus, but forged in faith and ceremony. At the very heart of this shrine, housed in a special niche or atop an altar, stood the object of ultimate veneration, the Aquila, the golden eagle. This was far more than a flag or a mascot. It was the physical embodiment of the legion's divine spirit, its genius. Crafted from gold or silver gilt, with wings outstretched and often clutching Jupiter's thunderbolts in its talons, the eagle was a stunning, tangible symbol of Roman power and divine favor. To lose the Aquila in battle was the ultimate, unthinkable disgrace, a catastrophe that could lead to the disbanding of the entire legion in shame. Its recovery was a matter of national obsession, a story fit for epic poets. But the eagle was not alone. Flanking it were the signa, the individual standards of each century. These were complex objects in their own right, tall poles topped with a variety of symbols, open hands, carved wolves, boars, or centaurs. They were adorned with gleaming metal discs, medallions, and sometimes even small wreaths, each one representing a battle honor or a decoration awarded to the century for collective valor. These were not merely for show on the parade ground. They were the focal points of a soldier's most sacred oaths and his most personal loyalties. The rituals performed in this space were the bedrock of military morale and discipline. The most solemn of these was the act of swearing an oath, the sacramentum. Upon enlistment, a new recruit would be brought before the standards in the Sacellum to pledge his life to the emperor and the empire. He wasn't just signing a contract, he was making a binding religious vow, calling upon the gods to witness his commitment. This spiritual contract was renewed every year on the 3rd of January, when the entire legion would assemble, and each man would swear his oath anew. The psychological impact of this ceremony, conducted in the shadow of the eagle and the battle-hardened signa, cannot be overstated. It transformed a legal obligation into a sacred duty, binding the soldier to his comrades and his unit with ties that were meant to be stronger than life itself. Alongside this formal oath was the daily act of veneration. Each morning, a small ceremony would take place where an offering of incense or wine would be made to the standards. Soldiers passing by the open doors of the caecilium might offer a brief prayer or a salute, asking for the protection and favor of the legion's genius for the day ahead. The standards were treated as living entities, divine companions on campaign who required care, respect, and sustenance. This spiritual ecosystem extended beyond the legion's own symbols to include the worship of the emperor's genius. A small statue or an inscription dedicated to the genius of the reigning emperor would have a place of honor within the caecilium. This was not necessarily the worship of the man himself as a god, but rather the veneration of his divine spirit, his guiding force and protective essence. By honoring the emperor's genius, the soldiers were reaffirming their loyalty to the central authority of Rome itself, the source of their pay, their orders, and their very identity. It was a powerful piece of political theology, making faith in the Roman state a core component of military life. This practice seamlessly connected the remote figure of the emperor in Rome to the daily reality of a soldier on the rainy frontier of Britain. It created a direct spiritual chain of command that ran from the emperor's household gods straight into the heart of the fortress. The psychological importance of this sacred space, especially for men living far from their homeland and their native gods, was immense. For a soldier recruited from Gaul or Syria, the familiar gods of his childhood might feel distant and inaccessible. The caecilium provided a new, powerful spiritual home. The legion's eagle and standards became his new household gods, the protectors of his military family. In moments of fear before a battle, or in times of grief after the loss of a comrade, the caecilium was a place to seek solace and strength. The rituals provided a comforting structure and a sense of cosmic order in a life often defined by chaos, violence, and the capriciousness of fate. The shared worship fostered an unparalleled unit cohesion. When soldiers prayed together before the same eagle, swore oaths on the same signum, and believed their collective fortune was tied to these sacred objects, their bond transcended the merely professional. They became a band of brothers under the watchful eyes of their divine protectors. The caecilium, therefore, was the ultimate consolidation of military power. It fused legal authority, political loyalty, and deep-seated religious belief into a single, unbreakable force. It assured the legionary that his service was not in vain, that his sacrifices were witnessed by the gods, and that the eagle he followed was a beacon of eternal Rome, guiding him through the terrors of the frontier and the uncertainties of his own mortality. Yet, while the sacred standards in the caecilium represented the soul of the legion, the empire's power ultimately rested on a far more tangible foundation: cold, hard cash. For that, we must return to the administrative heart of the Principia, but this time we descend from the grand halls into its most heavily secured and secretive space. Concealed beneath the floor of the strong room, or perhaps hidden behind an unmarked door, was the quaestorium. This was not a mere storeroom. It was the legion's treasury and central bank, a fortified vault where the financial lifeblood of the entire unit was stored, guarded, and meticulously managed. The name itself derives from the quaestor, a senior Roman official responsible for public finance, and within the military context, it signified the absolute center of fiscal authority for the legion. Within these thick, windowless walls lay the accumulated wealth that paid the soldiers, purchased vital supplies, and funded the ambitious construction projects that extended Roman influence across the globe. The physical security of the quaestorium was paramount, a masterpiece of ancient defensive engineering. Access was severely restricted, likely limited to the commander, his most trusted financial officers, and the clerks directly responsible for its contents. The door would have been a massive, reinforced construction of oak and iron, secured with a complex lock whose key was a heavily guarded object in its own right. Some archaeological evidence suggests that the strongroom itself was sometimes a sunken chamber, a stone-lined pit accessed only by a removable ladder, making any unauthorized entry both difficult and immediately obvious. Inside, the atmosphere was cool and dry, conditions carefully maintained to protect the room's most precious contents from the damaging effects of moisture. The primary residents of this space were the legion's pay chests. A Roman soldier's salary, while subject to deductions for food, equipment, and his burial club, was a substantial sum, paid in 3 installments throughout the year. For a legion of 5,000 men, the cumulative value of just one pay period represented a fortune in precious metal. This wealth was stored in heavy, iron-bound wooden chests, each sealed with multiple locks. The coins themselves were not loose piles of money. They were meticulously organized, often stacked in rolls or stored in leather bags, each denomination and batch carefully accounted for. Alongside the pay chests, the quaestorium would have safeguarded other forms of portable wealth, perhaps bullion bars of silver or gold used for large purchases, and the unit's reserve fund for emergencies. The sheer concentration of value in this one small room made it the most tempting target for corruption or theft, and thus its protection was a matter of the highest priority, with guards stationed outside its entrance at all hours. The management of this fortune fell to a sophisticated financial apparatus overseen by the quaestor, or, in his absence, the legion's chief financial officer, who worked in close concert with the commander. This was not a simple matter of handing out coins. It was a complex system of accounting and resource allocation that would be familiar to any modern chief financial officer. The officers in charge of the quaestorium were responsible for a continuous cycle of auditing and inventory. They maintained detailed ledgers, likely duplicate copies on wax tablets and papyrus, that recorded every single transaction. These records tracked the silver denarii and gold aurae flowing in from the provincial treasury, the precise amount allocated for the triennial pay distribution, and the funds dispersed for everything from purchasing grain from local farmers to commissioning a new set of armor from the fortress workshops. The system of deductions was particularly intricate. Before a soldier ever received his pay, the cost of his rations, his tunic, his sandals, and even the hay for his contubernium's mule were subtracted from his total. This ensured the army's logistical needs were funded upfront, directly from the soldier's own earnings, creating a self-sustaining economic loop. The clerks working under the financial officer would have spent days preparing for payday, counting out the exact sums for each century and verifying the lengthy deduction lists against each man's personal service record. This bureaucratic rigor was the bedrock of the Army's financial integrity, preventing embezzlement and ensuring that every soldier received exactly what he was owed, fostering a sense of fairness and institutional trust that was crucial for maintaining discipline and morale. Beyond the soldiers' salaries, the quaestorium also functioned as the central hub for the legion's broader material resources. It was the clearinghouse for the empire's vast supply network. When shipments of goods arrived at the fort, whether it was Spanish olive oil in large clay amphorae, fine wine from Italy, or high-quality iron ingots from Noricum for the smiths, their value was assessed and recorded by the quaestorium staff before the goods were distributed to the granaries, workshops, or other storage facilities. This allowed the commander to know not just the state of his cash reserves, but the total value of all assets under his control. The quaestorium was also instrumental in managing the legion's engagement with the local economy. The Roman army was a massive economic force in any province, and its soldiers, with their regular pay, had significant purchasing power. The fort became a magnet for traders and merchants. The financial officers would oversee the conversion of large denomination coins into the smaller bronze and copper currency needed for everyday purchases in the vicus, the civilian settlement that inevitably sprang up outside the fortress gates. They might also manage the army's sale of surplus goods produced by its own workshops, turning the legion into a producer and exporter, not just a consumer. This intricate financial web, all managed from the secure, silent confines of the quaestorium, highlights a fundamental truth about the Roman war machine. Its legendary discipline was not just a matter of battlefield tactics and rigorous drill. It was equally a product of economic discipline. The ability to reliably pay its troops, account for every resource, and manage a complex budget on a continental scale is what allowed the legions to remain in the field for decades, building the roads, forts, and cities that define the Roman world. The quaestorium was, in essence, the engine of this economic power, the secure, methodical, and utterly indispensable heart of the legion's financial stability. Yet for all the spiritual comfort of the shrine and the reliable order of the treasury, the Roman military machine was built on a foundation of iron discipline, a reality made terrifyingly tangible in the fort's darkest corner, the prison and guardhouse. If the Principia represented the brain and the law, and the barracks the heart, then the prison was the fort's clenched fist, a permanent reminder of the brutal consequences of breaking ranks. Tucked away, often near the headquarters for close supervision, this facility was not designed for long-term incarceration of enemy captives. Its purpose was far more intimate and grim. It existed to discipline the fort's own inhabitants, to house Roman soldiers who had violated military law and were awaiting judgment or undergoing punishment. Stepping into this space was to leave the camaraderie of the contubernium behind and enter a world of isolation, fear, and calculated suffering. The physical structure itself was designed to be psychologically oppressive. Archaeological evidence from sites like the fort at Caerleon in Wales points to a building that was fundamentally different from the barracks. Instead of long halls, it contained a series of small, dank, cellar-like cells. These rooms were often partially subterranean, sunk into the ground to make them damp, cold, and difficult to escape from. The walls were massively thick, not for defense against an external enemy, but to muffle sound and prevent communication between prisoners. Light and air would have come only from a small, high opening, far out of reach, leaving the cells in a state of perpetual gloom. The floors were typically bare earth or stone, and there were no raised platforms for sleeping. Prisoners slept on the cold ground. Unlike the barracks, where a soldier's space was personalized with his kit and small tokens from home, these cells were utterly barren. The only furniture might be a set of chains fixed to the wall or floor. This was an environment meticulously engineered to strip a man of his dignity, his comfort, and his connection to his unit, reducing him to his most basic state while he awaited his fate. The men who found themselves in these cells were not necessarily criminals in the modern sense. They were soldiers who had failed in their duty. The range of offenses was vast, from the seemingly minor to the gravely serious. A soldier could be imprisoned for falling asleep on sentry duty, a lapse that could jeopardize the entire fort. He could be there for theft from a comrade, for insubordination toward a centurion, for losing his sword or a piece of his armor through negligence, or for desertion. The process was formal. After being apprehended by the stationarii, the fort's military police, the accused would be stripped of his weapons and military belt, the very symbols of his identity, and locked in a cell to await a hearing. This was often a period of agonizing uncertainty, stretched out for days or even weeks while evidence was gathered and the commander's tribunal was convened. The isolation was a punishment in itself. A Roman soldier's entire existence was defined by his contubernium. To be ripped from that brotherhood and thrown into a silent, solitary cell was a profound psychological shock. When judgment came, it was delivered in the Basilica of the Principia, and the sentences reflected the army's merciless pragmatism. For capital crimes like desertion in the face of the enemy or striking a superior officer, the punishment was execution, often by beheading, or, for an entire mutinous unit, decimation. The lethal lottery where 1 in 10 men would be clubbed to death by their own comrades. But for lesser, yet still serious, offenses, the punishments were ingeniously cruel and directly tied to military service. The most common was a brutal beating with the vitus, the centurion's vine wood staff. This was not just a few sharp blows. It could be a protracted, bone-breaking flogging, sometimes administered in front of the entire assembled unit as a graphic deterrent. Another feared punishment was castigatio, being sentenced to hard labor. This wasn't just extra duty. It could mean being sent to work in the mines or the quarries, a virtual death sentence through relentless, brutal toil. Perhaps the most psychologically complex punishment was demotion and transfer. A soldier could be broken in rank, from legionary to insignificant, and then sent to serve in a different, often far-flung and undesirable legion. This was a destruction of his entire military identity. The reputation he had built, the camaraderie of his contubernium, the trust of his centurion, all of it was erased. He would arrive at his new post as a disgraced outsider, forced to start his career over from the very bottom, a marked man among strangers. This system of discipline, from the stark terror of the prison cell to the public spectacle of punishment, served one overarching purpose: to maintain absolute control. The Roman army could not function on individual bravery alone. It required the seamless, synchronized obedience of thousands of men. The threat of the guardhouse and the certainty of severe retribution were the dark incentives that ensured that obedience was never in doubt. It was the grim, unyielding counterweight to the bathhouse's comfort and the shrine's inspiration, a necessary shadow that ensured the legion remained a single, unstoppable entity. But beyond the administrative centers and the harsh reality of the prison, the most fundamental rhythm of the fort was set not by the centurion's command, but by the basic, universal need to eat. The scale of this operation is almost impossible to overstate. A single legion of around 5,000 men required a constant, colossal supply of food, and the heart of this daily effort was the on-site bakery, a place where the raw grain from the granaries was transformed into the true staff of life for the Roman soldier, bread. The unmistakable, comforting aroma of baking bread would have been a defining scent of the fortress, a daily promise of sustenance that cut through the smells of leather, sweat, and damp stone. This was not a small-scale operation for a few loaves. It was an industrial food production facility, a testament to the army's understanding that a well-fed army is a loyal and effective one. The process began with the most back-breaking chore, milling the grain. Before a single loaf could be baked, the hard wheat ration issued to each soldier had to be turned into flour. while individual contubernia would grind a small amount for their own daily use on portable hand mills. The bulk baking for the entire garrison required a much larger solution. The bakery was equipped with massive, animal-driven mills. Picture a large, circular stone base with a central, upright wooden post. A horse or a mule, blindfolded to prevent dizziness, would be harnessed to a long wooden arm attached to the post, walking in a perpetual, plodding circle. This turned a heavy, hourglass-shaped upper stone, called a catalyst, over a stationary lower stone, the meta. Workers would constantly feed grain in the top, and the relentless grinding action would produce a coarse, wholemeal flour that poured out from the sides. The sound in the bakery was a symphony of industry, the steady, rhythmic clopping of the animals' hooves on the stone floor, the deep, grating rumble of the millstones, and the shouted conversations of the soldiers assigned to bakery duty. This was hot, dusty, exhausting work, but it was the essential first step in fueling the legion. With the flour produced, the focus shifted to the true centerpiece of the bakery, the massive, vaulted ovens. These were not small, domestic hearths. They were large, permanent structures made of brick and tile, often with a domed roof that retained heat magnificently. The firing process was a carefully timed ritual. The oven would be filled with kindling and wood, which was set ablaze and allowed to burn down until the interior dome glowed with intense, radiating heat. Then, the ashes and embers were meticulously raked out, and the interior temperature was tested. The bakers, often soldiers with a knack for the craft, would then skillfully slide the shaped loaves of dough directly onto the hot oven floor using long wooden paddles. The loaves baked quickly in the fierce, retained heat, emerging with a thick, crusty exterior and a soft, airy interior. The scale was immense. An oven like those found at the fort of Pompeii could hold dozens of loaves at once, and baking would have been a continuous, round-the-clock operation to keep up with the garrison's demands. The sight of these rows of golden-brown loaves, each one stamped with an official seal denoting its origin and quality, was a powerful symbol of the army's logistical reliability. The Roman soldier's diet, while monotonous by modern standards, was carefully calibrated for energy and nutrition. The absolute foundation was grain, consumed as either bread or a thick porridge called palmentum. A soldier's monthly ration was around 30 to 35 kilograms of wheat, which provided the bulk of his calories for hard physical labor. But the diet was far from just carbohydrates. The army also supplied a regular ration of lardum salt pork or bacon, which provided essential fats and protein. This was often added to the palmentum, creating a hearty, if simple, stew. They also received rations of legumes like lentils and beans, which offered additional protein and fiber, and a daily allowance of acidum, a low-quality sour wine that was diluted with water. This vinegar wine was not just a beverage. Its acidity helped to mask the taste of questionable water, acting as a mild disinfectant and preventing waterborne illnesses on campaign. On occasion, a soldier might receive cheese, olive oil, or even some fresh vegetables, but these were supplements to the core triad of bread, porridge, and salted meat. This diet was not designed for pleasure, but for function. It was durable, transportable, and packed with the calories needed to march 20 miles in full kit, build a fortification, and then stand watch on a cold rampart. The social and psychological importance of this system cannot be overstated. The daily distribution of bread was a tangible, physical manifestation of the army's contract with the soldier. In return for his oath and his service, the state guaranteed his most basic need, food. This reliability was a cornerstone of military morale. A soldier who knew his next meal was secure was a soldier who could focus on his duties, not on his hunger. The bakery, therefore, was more than just a kitchen. It was a pillar of stability. The sight of the smoke rising from its ovens and the smell of fresh bread carried a message as potent as any imperial edict. You are provided for, you are part of a system that sustains you, and this fortress is your home. It transformed the abstract concept of imperial supply into a warm, crusty loaf of bread in a soldier's hand. A small but powerful comfort in a life defined by discipline and the ever-present threat of the frontier. But for all the bread baked in the ovens and the food stored in the granaries, none of it could sustain the fortress without its most crucial resource of all, a constant, reliable supply of fresh water. The staggering daily consumption of a full legion, numbering in the tens of thousands of gallons for drinking, cooking, the bathhouse, and the latrines, presented one of the Roman army's greatest logistical challenges. Their solution was a breathtaking display of practical engineering, employing two primary methods that worked in concert: the self-contained security of the well and the long-distance grandeur of the aqueduct. Within the fort's walls, the well was a cornerstone of defense in depth. It wasn't just a simple hole in the ground. It was a carefully constructed shaft, often lined with stone or timber to prevent collapse and contamination. Its location was strategic, positioned to be easily accessible to the barracks and key facilities like the hospital, yet far enough from latrines to safeguard against seepage. For the soldiers on daily duty, drawing water was a familiar chore. They would lower heavy leather buckets on ropes, hauling up the cool, dark water from the aquifer below. The well was more than a utility. It was a vital lifeline, ensuring that even under siege, when the fort was cut off from the outside world, the garrison could hold out for weeks or even months as long as the water held. This self-sufficiency was a fundamental principle of Roman military design, and the humble well was its most important guarantee. However, for the largest permanent fortresses, especially those housing thousands of men, a simple well was often insufficient. This is where Roman engineering ambition truly shone with the construction of aqueducts. These were not just channels for water. They were monumental declarations of Roman power and permanence, slicing through the landscape to bend nature itself to the army's will. An aqueduct was a gravity-fed marvel, a channel with a meticulously calculated, constant shallow slope, often as little as a few feet per mile, that guided water from a distant spring or river in the highlands down to the fort. The most iconic image, the soaring arcades of stone bridges carrying the water channel across valleys, was just one part of a much longer, mostly underground system. Tunnels were carved through hills, and trenches were dug across plains, all to protect the water supply from enemies and evaporation. The final destination within the fort was the massive Castellum Divisorum, or distribution basin. This was the terminus where the aqueduct's flow was channeled, filtered through settling tanks to remove sediment, and then meticulously divided through a series of bronze pipes and control sluices. The priorities were clear and pragmatic. A large volume was directed first to the public fountains for drinking water, then to the bathhouse for the essential hygiene and social rituals, then to the latrines to power their continuous flush, and finally, for any surplus, to private residences like the commander's house. This wasn't just a delivery system. It was a managed water grid, an ancient precursor to modern municipal utilities. The transformative impact of this engineered water supply on daily life in the barracks was profound. For the common soldier, It meant that clean drinking water was available from a fountain just a short walk from his barrack block. A simple luxury that prevented the waterborne diseases that decimated armies throughout history. It meant that the vast bath complex could operate daily, offering its essential service of cleanliness and relaxation. Most critically, it powered the sophisticated sanitation of the latrines, with their constantly flowing channels washing waste away and maintaining a level of public health that would not be seen again in Europe for over a millennium. This reliable abundance of water also fueled the fort's industrial capacity. The blacksmith's forges required water for cooling hot metal and for operating bellows. The tanning pits for leatherworking and the fuller's vats for processing woolen cloth all depended on a steady supply. The aqueduct, therefore, was the silent, unseen engine that enabled everything from the soldier's personal hygiene to the legion's industrial output. The steady, gentle flow of water into the fortress was a physical manifestation of Roman order, a constant reminder that even on the wildest frontier, the empire could replicate the comforts and capabilities of the civilized world, turning a military garrison into a self-sustaining monument to engineering and logistical might. But the true, relentless purpose behind every barrack block and workshop was forged not indoors, but out in the sprawling, open-air training grounds. This was the arena where the individual recruit was systematically broken down and rebuilt into the legendary Roman legionary, a process as disciplined and unyielding as the stone fortress walls that contained it. The barracks was never merely a place for rest and recovery. It was the launchpad for a daily regimen of physical conditioning and combat drills that turned cohesion into instinct and skill into reflex. The day's rhythm was dictated by the sound of the bucina, the military horn, and for many soldiers, the first call after dawn led them not to a construction detail or a patrol, but directly to the vast, open fields and specially constructed facilities dedicated solely to the art of war. The most fundamental and physically demanding of all these exercises was the practice march. Imagine the scene each morning, centuries of 80 men forming up in the crisp air, their heavy marching packs, the sarcina, loaded with everything from a change of tunic and rations to a wicker shield and entrenching tools. This wasn't a leisurely stroll. It was a grueling test of endurance, conducted at the military pace of 20 Roman miles in 5 hours, all while carrying a load that could easily exceed 60 pounds. The Centurion and his optio would move up and down the column, their sharp eyes missing nothing, their voices barking corrections at any man whose posture slackened or whose step fell out of time. They marched in full armor, the weight of their mail or segmented plates a constant, grinding reminder of the burden of their profession. The purpose was brutally practical, to inure the legionary to the very real demands of campaign life, ensuring that when the time came to march into hostile territory, his body was already hardened to the task, his muscles and mind conditioned to ignore fatigue. This daily ritual of measured, relentless movement was the bedrock of Roman mobility, transforming a collection of individuals into a single, earth-shaking entity that could appear with shocking speed anywhere along the frontier. Alongside the marching fields were the dedicated weapon training areas. Here, the iconic Roman short sword, the gladius, was mastered not on live opponents, but against solid wooden posts, often set firmly into the earth. These posts were the soldier's first and most constant training partner. For hours each day, recruits and veterans alike would practice their thrusts, cuts, and parries against the unyielding wood, the repetitive impact sending vibrations up their arms, the sound a constant percussive thud echoing across the grounds. The goal was to build the specific muscle memory required for the legion's preferred method of combat, closing with the enemy behind the large scutum shield and delivering short, brutal, stabbing thrusts into the abdomen and groin. The training was relentlessly pragmatic. There was no flashy, dueling-style swordsmanship here, only the efficient, economical movements that killed quickly and effectively in the press of a massed battle line. They also practiced with the pilum, the heavy javelin, hurling it at designated target posts to master the unique, overhead throwing motion that gave the missile its penetrating power. The emphasis was always on accuracy and force, ensuring that when a volley of pila flew toward an enemy formation, each one had the potential to punch through a shield and render it useless before the lines even collided. Perhaps the most fascinating and psychologically astute aspect of their training was the use of specially weighted practice equipment. To build superior strength and speed, soldiers didn't train with standard issue gear. Instead, they used wooden practice swords that were twice the weight of a real gladius, and wicker shields that were significantly heavier than their battle-ready scuta. The logic was brilliantly simple. After spending months building muscle and technique with equipment that felt leaden and slow, the moment a soldier picked up his actual, finely balanced combat gear, he would feel lightning fast and impossibly agile. This training method created a tangible physical advantage on the battlefield, where a fraction of a second in a thrust or a parry could mean the difference between life and death. It was a perfect example of Roman military pragmatism, a calculated approach to conditioning that directly translated into enhanced combat performance. This philosophy extended to the construction of the campus, the large, open field that served as the fort's all-purpose exercise ground. Here, soldiers would engage in running races, wrestling matches, and other competitive games. While these activities built general fitness, their deeper purpose was to foster a fierce, unit-centric competitive spirit. A century would compete against another century in mock battles or athletic contests, with pride and often small rewards on the line. This constant, friendly rivalry honed aggression, reinforced unit identity, and built the unbreakable bonds of trust that held the battle lines steady in the face of real terror. The training grounds were, therefore, the true crucible of the Roman military machine. They were the place where the empire's vast investment in logistics, engineering, and administration was ultimately converted into practical, battlefield dominance. It was here that the raw material of a new recruit, whether a conscripted farmer from Italy or a volunteer from the provinces, was subjected to a relentless process of standardization. His individual gait was molded into the legionary step. His natural reactions were replaced with drilled responses, and his personal strength was forged into the collective power of the shield wall. The barracks provided the shelter, the granary provided the fuel, and the workshops provided the tools. But it was out in the mud and dust of the training fields that the Roman soldier was truly made. The unceasing cycle of drill and exercise was a powerful daily reaffirmation of the legion's core philosophy, that victory is not a matter of chance or individual heroism, but the inevitable product of superior preparation, relentless practice, and an institutional commitment to perfection that left nothing to chance. Now, let us emerge from the specialized world of the workshops and training grounds and take a bird's-eye view of the entire fortress, for it was the overarching layout of the camp itself that orchestrated this complex symphony of daily life. The genius of a Roman fort was not just in its individual components, but in its rigid, grid-like street plan, a design so effective it was replicated across the entire empire, from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Germany. At the heart of this master plan were two grand, intersecting thoroughfares that functioned as the camp's central nervous system, the Via Principalis and the Via Praetoria. These were not merely dirt tracks. They were wide, metal-led roads, meticulously constructed with layers of gravel, stone, and sand, designed to drain quickly and withstand the constant pounding of thousands of marching feet, cartwheels, and hooves. Walking along them, you would feel the hard, cambered surface beneath your sandals, a testament to Roman engineering even in the most mundane aspects of military life. The entire fortress was essentially built around the cross formed by these two roads, dividing the space into four logical quadrants and imposing a sense of order upon the potential chaos of housing thousands of men and their supporting infrastructure. The Via Principalis, whose name translates to the Chief Street, was the grand east-west axis that connected the two main side gates of the fort, the Porta Principalis Dextra and the Porta Principalis Sinistra. This was the primary organizational spine of the entire garrison. To walk its length was to take a tour of the fort's most critical administrative and command structures. This street ran directly in front of the sprawling, imposing facade of the Principia, the headquarters building. Its wide breadth was necessary to accommodate the formal assemblies and the bustling traffic of clerks, centurions, and soldiers on official business constantly flowing in and out of the command center. Flanking the Via Principalis, you would also find some of the most prestigious addresses in the camp. The large, comfortable houses of the senior tribunes and the legate's own praetorium were often situated here, placing the high command immediately adjacent to the seat of power. The strategic placement of this street meant that key personnel and vital messages could move swiftly between the command hub and the main gates, without having to navigate a maze of smaller alleyways. It was, in every sense, the street of authority and order. Crossing the Via Principalis at a perfect right angle was the Via Praetoria, the road that led to the commander. This was the main north-south artery, running from the formidable Porta Praetoria, the front gate of the fort, straight down to the Principia. If the Via Principalis was the street of administration, the Via Praetoria was the road of ceremony and rapid deployment. Its primary function was to facilitate the swift movement of troops in and out of the fortress. When the legion marched out on campaign or returned from a long patrol, it was through the Porta Praetoria and down this majestic street that they moved. The sight would have been awe-inspiring, a seemingly endless column of armored infantry, their segmented armor glinting, their red shields a moving wall of color, the rhythmic crunch of their hobnailed sandals echoing off the buildings that lined the route. This road provided a direct, unimpeded channel from the outside world right to the commander's doorstep in the Principia. It was a physical manifestation of the chain of command, a direct line from the frontier to the commanding officer, ensuring that he could react with maximum speed to any threat or opportunity. The intersection of these two great roads, right in front of the Principia, formed the very center of the fortress, a vast open space known as the Groma, named after the surveying instrument used to lay out the entire camp. This central junction was the busiest and most symbolically charged point in the entire fort. It was here that the main cross streets met, and it served as a massive, open-air mustering area. During the pre-dawn hours, you might see sentries forming up here, receiving their daily orders from their centurions before dispersing to their duties on the walls, in the workshops, or out on patrol. It was also a major social and commercial hub. While the main market was often outside the walls in the vicus, the Groma would have been a natural gathering place. Soldiers from different units would meet here, food vendors might set up temporary stalls, and the air would be filled with the sounds of shouted greetings, bartering, and the dozens of different languages spoken by auxiliaries drawn from every corner of the empire. This constant, swirling activity at the crossroads made it the beating heart of the camp's daily social life. Beyond these two main arteries, the organization continued with ruthless efficiency. Parallel to the Via Principalis ran the Via Quintana, a lesser but still important street that serviced the rear portions of the fort, often running behind the barracks blocks and providing access to the granaries, workshops, and hospital. The entire remaining space was then filled with a perfect grid of smaller lanes and alleys, systematically separating the long, identical barrack blocks of each cohort. This standardized layout had an immensely practical, life-saving purpose. It eliminated confusion. A soldier transferred from a fort in Syria to one in Britain would immediately know his way around. In the dead of night, during a sudden alarm or an attack, a soldier could find his way from his barrack block to his assigned position on the ramparts through pitch darkness and driving rain, because the layout was identical everywhere. He knew to turn right out of his barracks onto the minor lane, left onto the Via Quintana, and then straight to his sentry's post. This predictability was a powerful force multiplier, ensuring that panic did not lead to chaos. The Roman fortress, therefore, was a masterpiece of urban planning whose primary material was not stone or timber, but control. The Via Principalis and Via Praetoria were the fundamental axes around which this control was exercised. They directed traffic, both human and logistical, with precision. They physically represented the hierarchy of the camp, with the most important buildings lining the most important streets. They enabled both the grand ceremony of a full legionary parade and the mundane yet vital movement of a cartload of grain from the main gate to the harem. This rigid street plan was a physical expression of the Roman military mind, orderly, logical, and relentlessly efficient. It transformed a temporary collection of soldiers into a permanent, enduring community, a little piece of Rome's unwavering order imposed upon the unpredictable wilderness of the frontier. These sprawling, well-organized streets and the life they contained, however, existed within a world defined by a singular, unyielding reality, the ever-present threat from beyond the perimeter. Every barrack block, every workshop, every storeroom full of grain was protected by a system of defenses so formidable that the Roman fort was less a military base and more a statement of territorial control carved in timber and stone. The walls surrounding the barracks were not simple property lines. They were complex, multi-layered instruments of psychological dominance and practical security, engineered to project an image of invincibility and to deliver overwhelming violence to any who dared test it. The transition from the bustling interior to the perimeter was a journey into a different mindset, one of constant vigilance and calculated defensive power. The first and most imposing feature was the wall itself, the vallum. In a permanent stone fortress, this was a massive curtain of mortared masonry, often reaching heights of 12 to 15 feet and stretching in an unbroken rectangle around the entire complex. But even in earlier or more temporary timber forts, the wall was a serious obstacle. It was typically constructed as a vertical breastwork of thick, interlocked logs, backed by a sturdy earthen rampart that gave it immense stability. The exterior face was often smoothed or sloped to make scaling it with ladders a treacherous endeavor. But the Roman defensive genius lay not in a single barrier, but in a system of layered impediments. Stretching out from the base of the wall, often at a distance of 30 or 40 feet, was the fossa the defensive ditch. This was no simple trench. It was a V-shaped excavation, meticulously dug to a depth of 8 or 10 feet, with steep, slick sides that were incredibly difficult to climb out of, especially under a hail of missiles from the wall above. An attacker who made it across this ditch would find himself in a killing zone, exposed and vulnerable, with the main wall still looming ahead. This combination of ditch and wall created a brutal geometric problem for any assault, slowing the enemy's approach and breaking their formation before a single Roman soldier had to engage in hand-to-hand combat. Rising from this wall at regular intervals were the wooden or stone towers, the burgi. These structures were the eyes and ears of the fortress, projecting out from the curtain wall to provide overlapping fields of vision and fields of fire. A soldier standing in one of these towers had a commanding view of the ditch below, the ground immediately in front of the wall, and the terrain stretching out toward the horizon. This design eliminated deadly blind spots where an enemy could gather unseen at the base of the fortifications. The towers served as elevated platforms for the army's artillery, the ballistae and smaller scorpions. These torsion-powered catapults could fire heavy bolts or stone shot with terrifying accuracy and force, capable of skewering multiple men or smashing through primitive shields at several hundred yards. The presence of these towers transformed the wall from a passive barrier into an active, aggressive defense system. They allowed the Romans to dominate the area well beyond their own gates, turning the open ground outside the fort into a shooting gallery controlled by their superior technology and disciplined crews. The gates themselves, the porti, were masterpieces of defensive architecture, far more complex than simple openings in the wall. Each major gate, the Porta Praetoria, Principales, and others, was a heavily fortified complex in its own right. They were often built as stone gatehouses, with twin towers flanking the entrance passage. This created a narrow, channelized kill zone for any enemy force that managed to break through the outer doors. The gates were constructed from massive, iron-reinforced timbers, incredibly resilient to battering rams and fire. Some featured a cataracta, a heavy portcullis that could be dropped in an instant to seal the passage, trapping attackers inside the gatehouse where they could be attacked from murder holes in the ceiling above. The sheer, overwhelming strength of these gates sent a clear, unambiguous message to any observer. Entry was by permission only, and forced entry would be met with a catastrophic and organized response. This entire defensive apparatus was brought to life by the relentless rhythm of the guard duty, the vigilii. The safety of the 5,000 men and the empire's treasure within did not rely on the walls alone, but on the unceasing watchfulness of the soldiers who manned them. Sentry duty was a sacred trust, a core responsibility that fell to every soldier in rotation. The watch was divided into 4-hour shifts throughout the day and night, with the tesserarius, a junior officer within the century, responsible for ensuring the smooth changing of the guard and knowing the daily watchword. This password, the signum, was a closely guarded secret, changed daily and issued by the commander himself. To approach a post at night without being able to immediately give the correct signum was to risk being cut down by the sentry on the spot. The sentry's role was one of profound isolation and concentration. Stationed on the high rampart walkway behind a protective parapet, or in the drafty, open-sided towers, a soldier's world shrank to the stretch of wall and ditch before him. In the deep silence of a frontier night, his senses were heightened to every sound: the call of a night bird, the rustle of grass in the wind, the distant howl of a wolf. He was listening for the telltale scuff of a footfall in the gravel of the ditch, or the muffled clink of metal that might betray a stealthy approach. This was a psychologically taxing duty. The fate of his entire contubernium, sleeping unaware in their barracks just a few hundred feet away, rested on his alertness. The consequence of failure in this duty was the most severe the army could deliver. The story of the sentry who fell asleep at his post is one of the most enduring legends of Roman military discipline for a reason. According to the stern legal code of the camp, a soldier found asleep on watch was condemned to death by fustuarium, a brutal execution by clubbing or stoning at the hands of his own comrades. This was not merely a punishment, it was a ritual of atonement. The entire unit would be formed up, and each man would strike the condemned soldier, symbolically purging the collective shame his negligence had brought upon them all. The terrifying certainty of this fate was a powerful, dark incentive that kept every sentry's eyes open through the long, cold hours of the night. It embedded the understanding that personal failure could lead not only to one's own death, but to the slaughter of one's friends and the loss of the eagle itself. This absolute, uncompromising standard of vigilance was the human element that animated the stone and timber, turning the impressive but inert defenses into a living, breathing system of protection. The walls, the towers, the gates, they were the body of the fortress's defense, but the sentries, driven by discipline and fear, were its ever-wakeful soul. Yet for all the grand strategy and military engineering, the most poignant stories of the Roman barracks are not told by the stone walls or the training grounds, but by the small, quiet objects the soldiers left behind. Archaeology allows us to step beyond the official records and peer into the private, human world of the legionary, a world filled with homesickness, faith, simple pleasures, and the universal need for connection. When we excavate the packed earth floors of a contubernium, we don't just find discarded military gear. We find the intimate debris of a life lived far from home. These personal effects of the letters, the gambling dice, the protective amulets, and the grooming kits transform the anonymous soldier from a component in a machine back into a person with fears, hopes, and a personality. Among the most emotionally powerful finds are the letters. The Roman army was a vast letter-writing culture, and the survival of documents from waterlogged sites like Vindolanda gives us a direct line to the thoughts of these men. Imagine a soldier from Gaul or Syria sitting on his section of the sleeping platform by the dim light of an oil lamp, carefully scratching a message on a thin sliver of wood with a stylus. These weren't grand historical treatises. They were the mundane, heartfelt stuff of daily life. We have birthday party invitations from officers' wives, requests for leave to visit a companion in another fort, and shopping lists for extra socks and underpants to combat the bitter British cold. But the most telling are the letters home. A soldier named Crottius, stationed in northern Britain, writes to his compatriot Veldius, who is about to return from a journey, simply saying, "It will be a happy day for me if you come home." Another, a cavalryman, receives a letter from home begging him to send money. These fragments reveal a profound sense of isolation and a desperate clinging to the bonds of family and friendship across the vast distances of the empire. The very act of writing was an act of defiance against the loneliness of frontier service, a way to bridge the gap between the rigid, masculine world of the barracks and the soft, familiar voices of home. Alongside the yearning for home was the need for escapism and camaraderie, and for that, the soldiers turned to games of chance. In nearly every barrack excavation, archaeologists find gaming pieces and dice. Roman dice, or tali, were often made from bone or antler, and unlike our modern cubic dice, They were elongated, with only 4 long sides numbered. Gambling was technically forbidden within the barracks, but the sheer volume of dice found suggests the rule was widely ignored. After a long day of drill or fortification work, the 8 men of a contubernium would likely have gathered around a board, perhaps scratched directly on the wooden sleeping platform, to play games like latrunculi, a complex game of military strategy, or simpler dice games. The clatter of the bones and the good-natured shouts of the players would have been a common evening sound. This wasn't just about winning a few copper coins. It was a vital social ritual. It broke the monotony, forged bonds through friendly competition, and allowed for a level of informal interaction that the strict military hierarchy denied them during the day. A lucky die, carefully saved and perhaps carried for years, was more than a toy. It was a tiny engine of social cohesion, a tool for building the trust and fellowship that made life in a crowded, stressful environment bearable. Perhaps the most personal and spiritually significant objects a soldier possessed were his religious amulets. The official state religion, centered on Jupiter and the cult of the emperor, was observed in the Sacellum. But a soldier's personal faith was often a much more intimate and eclectic affair. In the pockets of their tunics or worn on leather thongs around their necks, soldiers carried a miniature pantheon of protective deities. A recruit from Gaul might wear a small bronze ring with the symbol of a local Celtic god like Belenus. A soldier from the east might carry a carved gem dedicated to the Persian god Mithras, whose secretive cult was incredibly popular in the army. But the most common finds are phallic amulets, known as fascina. To the modern eye, they seem strange or humorous, but to the Roman soldier, they were deadly serious. The phallus was a powerful and ubiquitous symbol of good fortune, fertility, and, most importantly, the ability to ward off the evil eye and other malicious forces. It was a charm against bad luck, a plea for divine protection in a profession where death could come suddenly from a fever or a stray arrow. These amulets speak to the constant, underlying anxiety of military life. For all their discipline and training, Roman soldiers were deeply superstitious men who knew their fate was ultimately in the hands of capricious gods and fortune. Clutching a smooth, worn amulet before a battle was as much a part of their routine as sharpening their sword. Finally, we find the items that speak to a soldier's identity and his desire for self-respect, his personal grooming kit. The classic image of the grimy, unkempt soldier is shattered by the archaeological record. Every soldier possessed a small, personal care set. The centerpiece was the strigil, a curved metal scraper used in the baths to remove oil, sweat, and dirt from the skin. But they also owned fine-toothed bone combs, often double-sided, for managing hair and beards. Small pairs of iron tweezers were common for plucking unwanted hair. Excavations have even turned up ear scoops, used for personal hygiene. These weren't issued by the army. These were personal purchases, items a soldier chose to own and maintain. Their presence in the barracks tells us something crucial about the Roman military mindset. Maintaining a neat appearance was a point of pride, a marker of civilized Roman identity that distinguished them from the barbarians they fought. In the harsh, dirty environment of the frontier, the simple, daily act of combing your hair or cleaning your ears was a small but powerful assertion of your humanity and your connection to the sophisticated world of Rome. It was a way of preserving your sense of self amidst the enforced conformity of military life. So when we piece together these small artifacts, the heartfelt letter, the well-worn die, the protective phallic charm, and the polished bronze strigil, we see a portrait that is far richer than any history book could paint. We see a young man, far from home, seeking comfort in words, finding friendship in a game, placing his hope for survival in a small metal god, and clinging to his dignity with a simple comb. The barracks was more than a dormitory. It was the container for all of this humanity. It held not just soldiers, but sons, brothers, and friends, each trying to carve out a small, personal space in a vast, impersonal machine. These humble objects are their true legacy, a silent testament to the fact that while they served an empire, they lived their lives as individuals. Yet for all the bustling life contained within its walls, every Roman fortress had a clear and finite existence that began not with soldiers, but with the first line drawn in the dirt by a military surveyor. The creation of a new barracks complex was a breathtaking logistical undertaking, a process that transformed a patch of wilderness into a fully functional military town in a matter of weeks. Before a single trench was dug, a team of specialists known as agrimensors would arrive at the chosen site. Their most important tool was the groma, a simple but brilliant instrument consisting of a vertical staff with a crossarm from which plumb lines were hung. Using this, they could sight perfectly straight lines and right angles, laying out the entire fortress plan with astonishing accuracy. They would first establish the central point, the groma, and from there they would mark out the two main roads, the Via Praetoria and Via Principalis, creating the cross that would form the spine of the entire settlement. Every other street, every barrack block, and every major building was then meticulously plotted within this grid, ensuring that a soldier transferred from the Rhine to the Danube would find his way around in the dark without a second thought. This was the Roman military mind made manifest in the landscape. Order, predictability, and control imposed upon the chaos of the frontier. With the plan established, the real work began, and it was a spectacle of coordinated labor that must have stunned local observers. The entire legion became a mobile construction crew, with each soldier assigned a specific task based on a predetermined formula. The first and most grueling job was digging the formidable defensive ditch, the fossa. Thousands of men would work in shifts, using iron-tipped shovels and wicker baskets to move what amounted to mountains of earth. The spoil from this excavation was then used to build the rampart, the agger. This was not just a simple pile of dirt. It was a carefully engineered structure. Layers of turf, clay, and gravel were compacted to create a stable core, which was then faced with a revirement of sod or a timber breastwork. Behind this rampart, the carpenters would begin erecting the fort's wooden skeleton. The barracks themselves were typically built using a post-entrench construction method. Long, narrow foundation trenches were dug, and massive upright posts were set into them, the trenches then being backfilled with stone and tightly packed earth to hold the posts rock solid. Horizontal beams were then joined to these posts using complex woodworking joints, creating the framework for the long, rectangular barrack blocks that would house the Centurions. The sounds of this phase were a symphony of industry, the relentless chop of axes felling local timber, the grating of two-man saws, and the rhythmic pounding of mallets driving mortise and tenon joints home. The entire legion worked with the same discipline they applied to battle, and a basic fortified camp could be raised in a single day, while a more permanent timber fortress might be completed in a single campaigning season. As the decades passed, a fort's buildings required constant maintenance and often underwent significant upgrades, creating a layered archaeological record of its history. A barrack block was not a static entity. It was a living structure that evolved with its occupants. The original packed earth floors might be replaced with wooden planks to provide better insulation from the damp ground. Walls might be patched and reinforced, and roofing materials replaced after a particularly harsh winter. But the most telling transformations occurred when a fort transitioned from a temporary wooden outpost to a permanent stone garrison. This was a sign of the empire's deepening commitment to a region. The timber palisade would be carefully dismantled, and in its place, a massive stone curtain wall would rise, its foundations often sunk deep into the original earthen rampart. The wooden barracks, too, were frequently rebuilt in stone. The old post holes would be filled, and new foundations of mortared rubble would be laid, upon which stone walls, often with internal timber framing, were constructed. These stone barracks were far more durable and offered better protection from the elements. They also featured more sophisticated amenities, like proper hearths for heating and cooking, and sometimes even rudimentary drainage channels running beneath the floors. This cycle of repair and renovation speaks to the long-term presence of the unit. Each replaced roof beam, each repainted wall, and each new stone floor represents a year, a decade, or even a century of continuous occupation, a testament to the enduring nature of Roman military power in that location. However, the life of a barracks was not eternal. The end could come suddenly or gradually, but when a legion finally received orders to move on, the process of abandonment was as methodical as its construction. In some cases, especially during a strategic retreat, the evacuation was orderly. The army would not simply walk away from a vast storehouse of resources. They would systematically strip the fort of anything of value that could be carried. The aquila and the unit standards were the first objects to be carefully packed and removed, followed by the pay chest from the quaestorium. Weapons and armor from the armamentarium were distributed or crated for transport. Metal tools, portable forge equipment, and even the valuable millstones from the bakery would be taken. The soldiers would pack their personal kits, and the contubernia would dismantle their leather tents. What remained were the empty shells of buildings, the stone walls, the tile roofs, and any heavy, immovable items. In other instances, particularly during a period of crisis or a rapid withdrawal, the departure was more rushed. Archaeologists sometimes find hordes of coins hastily buried in the floors of barracks or the principia, a soldier's secret savings that he intended to return for but never could. These hidden treasures are poignant, silent witnesses to the sudden upheaval that could overtake even the most permanent-seeming Roman establishment. Once the soldiers were gone, the empty fortress began a slow transformation into the ruins we recognize today. Nature was the first to reclaim the site. Weeds would sprout in the cracks of the Via Praetoria, and the meticulously maintained drainage ditches would slowly silt up. The roofs, left untended, would eventually collapse, sending tiles cascading into the interiors of buildings. Timber components, like the massive posts supporting the barrack roofs, would rot away, leaving only the stone foundations and post pads as ghostly outlines. But often, the story did not end with mere decay. The abandoned fort became a ready-made quarry for later generations. Local settlers would cart away the finely cut facing stones from the walls to build their own homes and barns. The large, flat stones of the rampart walkways and the thick roof tiles were highly prized building materials. This systematic recycling explains why so many Roman forts today appear as low, grass-covered banks, the rubble cores of their walls, with all the good stone long since removed. In some remarkable cases, the ruins were not quarried but repurposed. The empty fort at Vindolanda, for instance, saw later settlers move in and build their own timber huts directly on top of the leveled Roman stone foundations, using the old, indestructible Roman road as their main street. The fort's skeleton persisted, shaping the landscape and human settlement for centuries after the last legionary had marched away. For archaeologists, these abandoned sites are like a time capsule, and the process of excavating a barrack block is a delicate dissection of this entire life cycle. The first clues often appear from the air, where crop marks or soil discoloration reveal the perfect rectangular outline of the fort and the ghostly grid of its streets. Once excavation begins, the layers or stratigraphy tell the story. The very bottom layer might contain the dark, organic stains of the original post-entrench construction, a perfect line of dark earth showing where the timber wall once stood. Cutting through this might be the foundation trench for a later stone wall, evidence of the fort's upgrade from wood to stone. The floor levels themselves are a rich archive. The earliest floor might be simple packed earth, but as the century wore on, new layers of clay and gravel would be added to level the surface, each one trapping the debris of daily life. In these floor layers, archaeologists find the lost items that give us such an intimate connection to the past. A single caliga nail, a broken comb, a worn-out die, or a bent silver coin. The final layer often contains the evidence of the end, a layer of charcoal and burned timber from a destructive fire, either from a hostile attack or deliberate demolition, or simply the collapsed rubble of the roof as the buildings succumbed to time. By carefully peeling back these layers, archaeologists can read the biography of the barrack block, from its disciplined birth, through its long and busy life of repairs and renovations, to its quiet, crumbling death and eventual rediscovery, allowing the stories contained within its walls to be told once more. So, when we step back and view the Roman fortress in its entirety, a powerful truth comes into focus. This was never just a collection of buildings where soldiers slept. It was a meticulously engineered, self-sufficient microcity, a complete world in miniature, designed for one overarching purpose: to project and sustain Roman power on the frontier. Within those formidable walls existed an entire ecosystem, a society built for war, yet sustained by a complex web of discipline, industry, and unexpected community. From the sacred eagle in the Principia to the humble loaf of bread from the bakery, every single element was interlocked, forming a machine of breathtaking efficiency. The legionary barrack block was the heart of this machine, but it was a heart that could not beat without the lungs of the workshops, the stomach of the granary, and the vigilant senses of the sentries on the walls. This was the Roman genius not merely in winning battles, but in building a portable, reproducible way of life that could be planted anywhere, from the Syrian desert to the Scottish Highlands, and function with the same relentless order. The story told by the contents of these barracks, however, is far richer than a simple tale of military might. It is the story of people. It is the story of the blacksmith whose hammer shaped the armor that protected a life. It is the story of the surgeon whose precise tools offered a chance at survival when the fighting was done. It is the story of the scribe, hunched over his wax tablets by lamplight, whose meticulous records ensured that every soldier was paid and every resource was accounted for. And of course, it is the story of the soldier himself, not as a faceless automaton, but as a young man far from home, finding comfort in a letter, camaraderie in a game of dice, and a fragile sense of security in a small, personal amulet tucked inside his tunic. The barracks contain the tools of conquest, but they also safeguard the fragile human spirit that wielded them. They were a place of profound contradiction, of brutal punishments and tender friendships, of rigid hierarchy and shared meals, of overwhelming loneliness and unbreakable brotherhood. As the echoes of marching feet and the glow of the forge fires have long since faded, we are left with these stories, etched not in stone, but in the small, quiet artifacts that survive. The next time you picture a Roman legionary, see him not only on the battlefield, but in his cramped contubernium, sharing a loaf of bread with the 7 men who were his family. See him relaxing in the steamy bathhouse, sharing news from across the empire. See him standing watch on a windswept rampart, gazing into the darkness beyond the wall, his fate resting on his own vigilance. The Roman barracks was the crucible where the empire was forged, one soldier, one meal, one disciplined day at a time. We've walked through its gates and explored its secrets, but the story is never truly complete. Now we turn it over to you. Imagine yourself walking those straight, orderly streets. Which part of this world would have drawn you in? Would you have been fascinated by the industrial clamor of the fabricy workshops, the solemn silence of the Sacrum shrine, or the simple human comfort of the bathhouse after a long day's drill? Let us know in the comments below which barrack element captured your imagination the most.